how you identify the processes that are responsible for, one, the development of fatty liver in the first place, but then as a more serious concept, the development of real problems within the liver, fibrosis and these other hardenings that we can see within the liver that actually really do increase our risk of things like cirrhosis and liver cancer and other things like that. Where do you tend to start when you think about fatty liver and NASH?
Yeah, I think what's worthwhile to think about is the different kinds of causes. It's always good to identify causes. And when you're talking about fats accumulation in the liver, one of the causes is a slow methylation process, a lack of choline feeding into the ability to make phosphatidylcholine, because to get fats out of the liver, you require phosphatidylcholine. And it turns out that something like human deficiency, Western deficiency at least, in choline, about 150 milligrams a day. If you count in milligrams, it's the nutrient that's probably the most deficient in our diet by milligrams, is choline, particularly for vegetarians. And those of us who've gone into the study of methylation know that there can be a lot of other glitch points within that whole methylation process. So B12 will be short in vegetarians as well as choline. So just simply because of nutritional deficiency of critical nutrients that allow for fat to move back out of the liver, many vegetarians sneak into a fatty liver, and partly also because they tend to have a high carbohydrate diet. So then we start going over to the next major area of causes for fatty liver disease. And so now we go into the whole insulin resistance arena. So insulin resistance essentially means that the insulin levels in the blood are going up, and in parallel with that you'll see the HbA1cs are going up as well, because the average glucose level is going to be higher because the insulin is not handling the surges of glucose during the meal. To really determine well whether there's an insulin resistance, you do an insulin response test, which is a bit like the oral glucose tolerance test, but you're taking insulin levels during the time as well. And when it shoots over 100 of whatever the units are, that person has an excess shot of insulin at that time. And usually the glucose is showing some kind of odd response at the same time. Okay, so now we're talking about insulin resistance. Insulin resistance, the high insulin levels, cause the excess production of triglycerides in the liver. So you see the triglycerides going up. Now at first it's just in the hundreds. I start to look at them when they go past 100 and think, what's the necessity here? More choline, or perhaps it's to do with the insulin side already. But certainly once it's getting into the 200s, and especially by the time it's getting into the 300s, the LDL cholesterol has elevated. The more the triglycerides are up, the smaller the density of the particles of the LDLs become. So what's the consequence? The small dense LDL particles are the ones that actually cause arteriosclerosis. So they get into the blood vessels and oxidizing and damaging and causing all that foam cell and all that next stage of heart disease. So that's all metabolic syndrome, that last section I just spoke of. A metabolic syndrome, it's better to use as the word than insulin resistance, which really only gives you a hint of things starting off, because metabolic syndrome is saying there's a lot going on. So now we've got pre-diabetes, we've got the cholesterol going up, we've got a fatty liver, we've got all of this trouble with the inability to make energy efficiency at the cellular level. You've got a metabolic syndrome. It's better to think of it as that. And then to me, fatty liver is the liver sign of having metabolic syndrome, so it's actually a symptom of. We usually just list hypertension and the raising of the HbA1c and abdominal obesity, fatigue. It tends not to be on that list, fatty liver, but it belongs there. It's as prevalent as the other things. In fact, the raising of the blood pressure will probably only happen after the damage is happening to the blood vessels.
This is a really key point, and I think one of the things, and I'm sorry to interrupt your flow a bit there, but one of the key things that I think from a clinical standpoint that you see are people coming in with high blood pressure first, And for them as a patient, it's actually, I'm getting headaches, or there is some form of symptom, and you check their blood pressure as a byproduct of just the normal physical consultation, or just as part of an initial assessment. All of a sudden they're hanging in the high 40s to 150, and they're like, you'll make a remark to them saying, your blood pressure's a bit high. Yeah, it's been that way for a little while now. What they don't understand is that this is actually an advanced stage of how the cardiovascular system's expressing the damage within it coming from these things. And I really wanted to stress that, is that I think, one of the key points about thinking about metabolic syndrome is actually understanding that blood pressure is the third stop in a train line that's kind of leading somewhere that's only really got 5 or 6 stops.
Yeah, I think if we're talking in generalizations in the biggest numbers of the most common causes, yeah, I think we're right, because there are other genetics that could trigger off blood pressure and bits and pieces on the edges. But if we take the average Joe who's got the abdominal obesity and he's drunk a bit too much, and it might not quite classify as in or outside of the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but generally they're not heavy drinkers that we're talking about, but it's part of the whole calorie intake, and they've got a fairly high carb intake, possibly with the elevated level of saturated fats in their diet still, which I'll take to another topic. So I said that there's several kinds of causes, and so far we've just dealt with some nutritional deficiencies of key elements that allow for methylation to happen, but that's food input like vitamin B12 and choline, to a certain extent betaine and methionine, amino acids, again back on our discussion about detoxing, Phil. So those amino acids that are important to help methylation work, along with the B vitamins and especially B12, folate. Now those things, let's say there are often some bits are missing, but we always know that from genetics, the genetics are like a predisposition, but then the environment has a bigger role to play in percentage terms. And so how do you strain that methylation system? So just now I'm dropping out of talking about insulin and how that causes fat and the VLDLs and all of that. What I'm talking about now is methylation, one of the protective systems within the liver that's a detoxification, one of the 5 different ways that the liver detoxes. And along with glutathione, the methylation is like they're the king and queen. I'm not sure who's the masculine, who's the feminine. Maybe the B vitamin is a bit more feminine, and glutathione's kind of like a bit more sort of sharp. Maybe it's the masculine, but
they need each other just as much as they think.
They do. They're highly interdependent.
No matter what.
If you get the SAMe levels up in the liver, the glutathione sorts itself out, and to a certain extent it goes the other way. But more so that the SAMe is probably the ruler when I start to think about it and say it like that, because you fix the SAMe levels, and the glutathione levels can be raised as well. Okay, now I'm hoping that the listeners kind of understand some of this, because when I talk about methylation, it's either like you get it or it's a vacuum, no information, and it's a bit too much to fill out in this discussion. But it's an important detoxification process as far as the liver goes,